Hi, this is Professor Joe Boulder, and welcome to my video on algae. During this video, I'm going to talk about algae in a very general manner. I'll have other videos that will deal more specifically with each individual algal species or groups. But before we go into more details about algae, I first want to show you this slide on the kingdoms of life. This is going to help clarify how we classify algae in relation to all other living organisms. Algae as a group of living organisms do not share a common ancestor, so I can only imagine that their classifications will change over time to best fit their genetic relatedness. But for the moment, we have the 6 kingdoms of life scheme. Here we have the plant, the plantae, we have the kingdom fungi, the kingdom animalia, the protista, the kingdom bacteria, and the kingdom archaea. Right here in the center, the protista are composed of a hodgepodge group of organisms with many different ancestral lineages. They don't fit into any other kingdoms, so for this reason, the protista is basically considered now to be a group instead of a kingdom. So we have the 5 kingdoms: plantae, fungi, animalia, bacteria, and archaea, and the group protista. We can divide these kingdoms and the protista into 2 major groups based on their cell types. Each living organism is either composed of eukaryotic organisms or prokaryotic organisms. Members of the bacteria and archaea are made of prokaryotic cells. That means that their cells do not contain a membrane-bound nucleus. Instead, they have a chromosomal DNA that is not surrounded by a membrane. It is free in the cytoplasm. It is called a nucleoid. Also, these organisms do not have membrane-bound organelles. Whereas members of the plantae, fungi, animalia, and protista are all composed of eukaryotic cells. That's to say that their cells contain nuclei, or nucleus singular, and they all have membrane-bound organelles. So remember from your past lectures in other classes that these organelles include mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulums, both the smooth and the rough, and various vesicles. So where I'm going with this is a lecture on algae, and so I want to focus on this center region here called the protista. Remember that I said that members of this group, protista, are basically a hodgepodge group of organisms that have different ancestral lineages. This group contains algae as well as protozoas. So I've listed here the green algae, diatoms, brown algae, I'm forgetting the red algae here, and the dinoflagellates. These are going to be the major groups of algae that I'll cover in my next lectures. But there's also some protozoas that I've mentioned here. So these members together form this polyphyletic group. What the term polyphyletic means is that there are just many different ancestral lineages. So if we look at them genetically, we find that they do not relate to each other or are not genetically similar to each other and thus do not have a common ancestor. This makes it very difficult to study these organisms and to try to classify them. But nonetheless, they're put together in this group of protista because there's some generalized characteristics that apply to all of them. For instance, the algae are considered as the plant-like protista, whereas the protozoas are the animal-like protista. I'm going to go through some of these characteristics, but before I do, I just want to stop and briefly mention the cyanobacteria. You might come across a classification scheme that groups these prokaryotic photosynthetic microorganisms as blue-green algae. However, more recent scientific data shows that these cyanobacteria actually belong in the kingdom Bacteria. That is, that they are made up of single prokaryotic cells. And so for my lectures, I don't consider them as being algae. Instead, I consider them as being prokaryotic cells and members of the kingdom bacteria. So I'm going to leave those out. So let's get on with the algae. Algae vary in their color, in their habitat, from being unicellular, that means single cell, all the way to multicellular, meaning made up of more than one cell, being macroscopic or microscopic. Microscopic means that you need to view them under a microscope. Macroscopic means that you can see them without a microscope. Also, in their cell wall structure, some of these algae will have different carbohydrates in their cell walls. All these characteristics are used to group these algae into these major phyla or groups as listed here. So I have the 7 major groups as the brown algae, the red algae, the green algae, dinoflagellates, diatoms, and water moles. I've listed their corresponding phylum names here on the right, respectively, and it's good to know the group names and the phyla names because whenever you search these organisms on the web or look through literature, you'll see that both names will be used. So it's good to know that you're talking about the same or different organisms. Now, unlike their fellow protozoas, all algae have a cell wall. All the groups except for diatoms have cellulose as one of their major cell wall components. If you look down the list, you also see other components such as algin, agar, carrageenan, pectin, silica. I'll go into more details of these components when I talk about each individual groups in my other lectures. So for this video, it's important to know that algae have a cell wall, and these cell walls are made out of various carbohydrates. And this is what differs them from the protozoa, the other protista, which do not have a cell wall. Other characteristics of algae are their size and cell arrangement. Now, algae's size can range from being microscopic. That means that we need a microscope to see them. Also, there are those that are much larger, shown down here as the macroscopic. These macroscopic organisms can reach dimensions greater than 60 meters in length. That's about 200 feet. The microscopic organisms tend to be unicellular, and sometimes they are motile. I'll talk more about motility later in this lecture, whereas those that are macroscopic are not motile or motile. These microscopic organisms can be arranged in different types of arrangements. So focusing on the microscopic organisms, they can tend to be just unicellular. That means a single cell organism. Or they can be grouped together colonially, as I'm showing you here on the right. These are 8 single organisms, 8 unicellular organisms that are grouped together by this gelatinous sphere. They come together as a colony to help acquire food. It's also most often a reproduction phase. So these algal cells come together, they enclose themselves inside a hollow type sphere, and they tend to be motile, so they'll have little flagella sticking out. You could probably make out little lines that represent the flagella. So they tend to have a pair of flagella. In this manner, as they are able to sense their surroundings, they can beat their flagella together in unison to move towards something that attracts them or away from something that could be toxic or harmful for them. For instance, these are photosynthetic organisms. Therefore, these organisms will work together using their flagella to swim towards light. The next major form of arrangement are that of the multicellular filamentous arrangement. Now these could be both microscopic and macroscopic. It just depends how large these cells, how large the filaments are. So it's kind of a gray zone. But either way, these filaments are cells that are attached end to end. They could also be branched or unbranched. Now I've included an example here on the left of a filamentous arrangement. Now, if you look carefully, you can see that there are cells that have green, that's the chloroplast. There are individual lines in between that separates each cell, and what you notice is that the cells are attached end to end. That is a true characteristic of filaments. This one in particular is unbranched. The last arrangement is considered to be a complex arrangement. These are multicellular algae. They are more complex in nature, as you can see here in the bottom, and they oftentimes resemble that of plants. Now, as I zoom in on this picture, this is an example of a brown algae that I found on the beach last summer. It has particular fronds. These fronds look like leaves, but they are not. It has a hold fast that basically anchors it to a rock or to a solid surface. But like I mentioned, it does not have leaves. These are not considered true stems, and it doesn't have a plant vascular system. Therefore, it puts this organism into the algae category. However, like plants, algae are photosynthetic. That means inside their eukaryotic cells, they have chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll. Let me briefly mention the exception, though, before I go on, is that this is true for all algae except for the water moles. Now, for the algae, with the exception of the water moles, besides having chlorophyll, they also have different light-sensitive accessory pigments. It's the combination of the chlorophyll and these accessory pigments that give them the different colors. And also importantly, though, is that these pigments and chlorophyll play the major role in photosynthesis. Just as in plants, algae uses the energy from the sun, the light energy, that works on water molecules. It releases the energy from these water molecules and thus forms oxygen. That released energy is then used to take 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and generate 1 molecule of sugar, a carbohydrate. Equally amazing, though, is that algae produce 70 to 80% of the Earth's atmospheric oxygen as a byproduct of this photosynthesis reaction. Also, algae produce enough carbohydrates not only for their own use, but enough to support the entire marine and freshwater food chain. So what that means is that without algae, all aquatic life would cease to exist. So I'm showing you here a slide in which we have algae, which are the producers of carbohydrates. They, as I mentioned, produce enough organic nutrients that are then eaten or taken up by the primary consumers, the shrimp, the protozoas, copepods. These are small living organisms. They in turn get fed or are food for small fish as the secondary consumers, which then are fed upon by the tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, etc., etc. So if we were to remove all the algae from any marine or aquatic environment, all these other organisms shown below algae would cease to exist. So it's pretty amazing how important these little living organisms are for the ecosystem on our planet Earth. Now again, all this gets back to the fact that these algae have the ability to undergo photosynthesis. They produce oxygen, they produce carbohydrates. Another aspect of these algae that I want to mention is that, as I mentioned earlier, they have chlorophyll, but they also have different light-sensitive pigments. Now these pigments help these organisms live in different environments, different habitats. The reason is that these accessory pigments absorb wavelengths absorbs light of different wavelengths. For example, red light, as shown here on the right, is going to absorb through the water first. So as the water gets deeper, less light will make it at greater depths of the water. Next comes the yellow, the green, the purple violet, and the blue light. The blue light actually is able to penetrate water deeper. So if these algae contain pigments that are able to absorb blue pigment, then these organisms or these algae are going to be able to survive in deeper depths of water. So as I tried to indicate in this slide, I have the sunlight, which has a wide spectrum of visible light. This visible light is hitting the surface of a body of water, and as it's doing this, the red visible light is absorbed first. So it only penetrates roughly through the first 50 feet or 50 meters of water. The other end of the spectrum are the blue light, which is able to go as far as down as 250 meters. So thus, if algae express the right combinations of pigments that are capable to absorb light at any given depth of water, then they will be able to survive. Because remember, they're required to absorb this light so that they can undergo photosynthesis. Green algae can best absorb red light and can only be found within the top surface of water. So I'm showing you here green algae. Whereas the red algae express blue light absorbing pigments, allowing them to survive at deeper waters. So this pretty much covers the different characteristics that I'd like you to know about algae in general. What I'm hoping that you should take from this video is that algae are diverse in many ways, thus allows them to grow and reproduce in various moist environments. Now, most algae are found in fresh water, others will be found in marine waters. The most common organisms are all in these aquatic habitats. Few others are going to be found on rocks and soil and plants, but again, they have to be moist environments. Some are going to be found in very extreme temperature conditions, such as hot springs, in the snow and ice. Some are even able to grow inside other organisms, such as the small single-cell protozoas that we call euglenoids. Animals and human tissue are generally not habitable by algae, thus they are rarely associated with infectious diseases. But the major threats that algae has to animals and humans is due to the type of food poisoning that are found, specifically due to the toxins that they express. So you've probably heard of red tide. Red tide is due to a toxin that a specific type of organism or algae secretes. Talk more about red tide when we talk about dinoflagellates. So lastly, I'd like to leave you a video on motility. I mentioned that some algae are motile, whereas others are non-motile. Those that are motile tend to be microscopic. They can be both single or colonial. They are often motile by means of gliding or swimming. So first in these videos are single-cell algae. So what you see here on the right are single-cell algae. They tend to be twittering around, and that's because they have a flagella. This is the same type of organism, just more focused upon or zoomed in at higher magnification. If you watch it, you can probably see a couple hair-like structures coming on the very top. This represents the two flagella. Now these flagella pull the organism along. Now we go to the colonial. These are the single-cell organisms that are grouped together. Here is a bunch, here I assume it's like 8 organisms. They're grouped together into this gelatinous type of sphere, and their flagella are sticking out. As you watch this motion, you can sometimes make out the flagella sticking out of the sphere. Again, they all have to be together so that these 8 unicellular organisms can go into the same direction. Diatoms are very geometric. They don't have flagella, but they move very fast. They tend to have pores at the apex. That means at the ends of their cells. And they basically are able to have water enter one pore and secrete it out the other end in the opposite pore. And this allows them to glide in their surface. It's the diatom that tends to rotate around. One end is quite flat, and then as it turns around, you can see the true width of the organism. They tend to be very, very geometric. Here's a second type of diatom. As he goes in one direction, and then he can then back up and go to the opposite direction, showing that they're just not only able to move in one direction. Desmids are a type of green algae. They come in various forms. Here's one form. Now the literature says that they do have some type of motility, whereas this is an example of basically they're not moving very much. This organism is just moving around with the water. Here's another type of desmid. I'm going to quickly go over this so that we don't waste time, but there's no motility there. This is a dinoflagellate, which has a couple flagella that whips around, allows it to move quite fast. This class of organisms are what's associated with harmful algal blooms or red tide. However, not all of them are the result of red tide. But again, the mode of motility here is because of the flagella. And that nears the end of the video. So this is the end of this video, but please look for my other videos in which I will talk about the various groups of algae in more detail. Thank you.
Algae are primitive plants which are found in water habitats. They can be found both in fresh water as well as in marine water. Very few of these organisms can survive on land. You must have seen the pond water covered with grass-like plant. This green structure is nothing but algae. Algae which are found floating on water are called phytoplankton. A well-developed plant has stem, leaf, and roots. But in case of algae, there is no root, stem, or leaf-like structure, and thus they are classified as thallophyta. In fact, algae body is known as thallus. Algae are found in different forms. It is both microscopic and macroscopic. It is unicellular as well as multicellular. Some unicellular algae such as chlamydomonas can perform movement, but there are some unicellular algae such as chlorella which are unable to move on their own. Some multicellular algae have branched filament structure such as Cladophora, whereas some have unbranched filaments such as Spirogyra. Some algae such as Macrocystis are very big like kelp. Some algae such as Volvox are found as colony. Generally, algae do not have sex organs, but algae like Chara possess well-developed sex organs. Most of the algae contain chlorophyll pigment and thus capable of preparing their own food. There are some algae which form symbiotic relation with fungi. Such symbionts are called lichen. There are some algae which are completely dependent on other plant for food. Such algae are called epiphytes. Algae are non-flowering plants. In this video, we will learn about reproduction in algae. Reproduction is the process by which new organisms are formed. Reproduction can be of two types, 1. Sexual reproduction, and 2. Asexual reproduction. For sexual reproduction to take place, both male and female are required, but asexual reproduction takes place through seeds, spores, etc. Algae reproduce both sexually and asexually. There are different ways asexual reproduction takes place in algae. 1. By vegetative reproduction or fragmentation. In this reproduction, Algae breaks down into small fragments and these fragments grows to bigger organisms. Spirogyra reproduces in such fashion. 2. Asexual reproduction through spores. Spores are small cell which germinates to become full-grown plants. In this reproduction, first spores produces male and female gametes, and then these gametes fuse together to form zygote which grows into a plant. Sexual reproduction can be of two types. 1. Scalar-reform conjugation. In this process, male and female gametes are obtained from different filaments in the same algae. At microscopic level, algae are formed by chain of filaments. During scalar-form conjugation, filament with male and female gametes get connected and a new plant is formed. 2. By producing sex organs. Some algae do not have sex organs since beginning but they grow them later. In such algae, male sex organ is called antheridia and female sex organ is called archegonia. Chara is a freshwater algae which reproduced by growing male and female sex organs.
You know when you're minding your own business, swimming in a lake or ocean, and suddenly that green blob touches you and you're not down? That stuff could power your house, your car, and it could even stop global warming. Hey there, muckrakers. Thanks for watching D-News. I'm Trace. Algae is plural. It encompasses a large number of stemless, rootless, leafless, usually monocellular plants that get energy from photosynthesis. Algae exist in many colors: red, yellow, purple, brown, black, and of course green and blue-green. All of these absorb light and turn it into energy. Algae are a basic food source for both salt and freshwater animals and birds. Their decomposition releases minerals into the water, and their mass provides a refuge for small fish and invertebrates. If nature loves it so much, why don't humans?
It's a completely renewable source, and it's made from sunlight and carbon dioxide and water, and so it's a very sustainable, renewable fuel.
That's Dave Hazelbeck, founder of Global Algae Innovations. He thinks these tiny plants can be way more valuable than they are already. Steve Woods is a mechanical engineer, and he works with Dave turning algae into fuel for cars, trucks, and airplanes.
The ones that we deal with are microalgae, so it's a little single cell, and you could start with just a single cell and grow it all the way out and just have them multiply and everything. Just growing plants, you just feed them what they need, and carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and stuff, and they just grow and they multiply like crazy.
For some D-News episodes, that's a bad thing. But for this, you want it to multiply. Eventually, it'll fill up these pools they call raceways, and Steve will pull them out, drain the water, and dry it all out. That's actually really hard, by the way. The dry algae can be turned into food for animals or people.
And when you do feed them certain things or stress them in certain ways, they can produce oils and different things that are beneficial for like nutraceuticals or pharmaceutical stuff and everything, so it's kind of cool.
There are over 100,000 different types of algae, and they store energy in the form of oil.
And the oil can be easily converted into drop-in fuels, which means it can be converted into gasoline, diesel, and jet that can be used directly in current engines. You don't need any special modifications or anything to run an algae biofuel. The fuel that we're producing is exactly the same in terms of performance as gasoline or diesel or jet. Renewable diesel actually performs better than petroleum-based diesels.
Biofuels like these are energy sources that come from living matter. They stand apart from fossil fuels, which, by the way, also come from living matter, because biofuels are made now, not over millions of years. You've probably heard of ethanol, a fuel made from corn. It's easy to make with the industry we already have, but it's not the best biofuel.
It takes a lot of time to grow a whole field of corn, but to grow out a lot of algae is a lot faster, and it's just a plant.
On top of that, the U.S. Department of Energy believes algae could be 10 or 100 times more productive than other bioenergies. Biofuels aren't new. Henry Ford's Model T was designed to run on ethanol, but ethanol only packs about half the punch of gasoline. As people recognize the issues with global warming and climate change, biofuel technology has only gotten better. Fossil fuels release carbon that was trapped inside of our planet for millions of years, but because biofuels are plants,
You're capturing the carbon dioxide, and so it's not being released. And that's part of it. You can grow algae 40 times more algae per acre than you can with terrestrial crops. And as a result, you don't have all the deforestation.
On top of that, these biofuel farmers only need the oil. The algae can be used for industrial applications in food and in drugs. The algae even contains omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids that are required for healthy humans, but difficult to find in the food chain. Algae are pretty incredible little organisms, but this process isn't perfect yet. In the past, because it's been very difficult to remove algae from the water, biofuel has been very expensive, though, according to Dave, they are now down to only $2 or $3 a gallon to make it. Though, they still can't make enough to compete with larger petrogas companies. Hopefully, someday in the future, algae raceways like these could replace oil fields and gas stations will just pump out biofuel. Algae could also stop global warming in its tracks. Seeker Stories got to actually go to this plant in Hawaii where the biofuels are made, and they learned how algae plus power plants equal a healthier Earth because it offsets their carbon footprint. Check it out here.
And this is next to a power plant. It's unique because that allows us to capture carbon dioxide and avoid that discharge and reuse it, and that prevents it from going into the atmosphere and causing global warming.
Would you put algae in your tank? How about in your mouth? I mean, it is a food source after all. Let us know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe for more D News, and thanks for watching.